Returning to something I did a few years ago, today I'll be covering an HP Lovecraft story adapted to manga by Go Tanabe. At the Mountains of Madness is the longest story Lovecraft ever wrote and a personal favorite of mine. He wrote the story in 1931, though it was initially rejected by his usual publisher, Weird Tales magazine. He took the rejection badly and put it aside for several years. His literary agent submitted it to Astounding Stories magazine in 1935, and it was accepted, being serialized over several monthly editions in 1936. This version was heavily edited by the magazine, however, including several lengthy passages from the end of the story being removed entirely. Lovecraft was so incensed by this that he described the magazine's editor as "that goddamn dung of a hyena." A fully restored text wouldn't be published until almost 50 years later in 1985, decades after Lovecraft's death. The story would be adapted to manga by Go Tanabe and published in 2016, released in English by Dark Horse in 2019 in 2 volumes. A hardcover deluxe edition was released in 2024. The story itself draws inspiration from Edgar Allan Poe's only novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, which also deals with exploration of the South Pole and is directly referenced in the story. For a very long time, the existence of Antarctica was unconfirmed. No known human reached the continent until the 1800s. The geographic South Pole was only reached by explorers in 1911, within H.P. Lovecraft's lifetime, and it seems that the mysterious, hostile environment of the poles was a source of fascination for Lovecraft, even from a young age, as he allegedly wrote several short stories set in Antarctica during his childhood. By the time Lovecraft wrote this story, there were still some blank parts of our map of the continent, and he drew inspiration from the then just completing 1928 to 1930 Byrd Antarctic expedition, which further explored the region. With all that out of the way, let's return to the Cthulhu mythos and begin our journey at the Mountains of Madness. Prologue. After the Storm. The date is January 25th, 1931. The Miskatonic Antarctic expedition has arrived by plane at the campsite of one of their survey teams. 3 days prior, Professor Lake had led a 12-man crew to this location, but they soon lost radio contact. Lake's last transmission before the weather worsened described an astounding discovery. The storm that followed was the worst they'd seen since arriving on the frozen continent, disrupting any chance at clear communication. So when they came upon what remained of Lake's camp and found it scattered and covered in snow and ice, they assumed some unforgiving polar vortex had annihilated Lake and his team. It quickly became clear that this was not the case when they found the bodies. They were in pieces, some stripped to the bone. In one tent, 3 hung from what used to be a roof, while the remains of a 4th lay on a table. The dogs had suffered the same fate as the men. They were not torn apart by some bestial force. Rather, their bodies showed signs of being carefully incised and dismantled, meat and organs cut away as if by a skilled butcher. Perhaps oddest of all, there was a sprinkling of salt from the provisions chest around the bodies. No, there was something stranger. A mound of snow in the shape of a 5-pointed star. All of this in the shadow of the mountains, towering titans uncharted by man. Dark, sinister, and filled with fear. The expedition members gaze in trepidation at those strange peaks, utterly isolated here at the bottom of the world. With that foreboding opening, we move on to the story proper, beginning with a quote from explorer Captain James Cook, who encountered Antarctic ice in 1775 and speculated on the existence of a southern polar continent. Noting the sheer hostility of the environment and bleak reality of a continent shrouded by fog and ice, whose ground would never know the sun, he suspected that its exploration would not benefit us. Then we get a page recapping information about Antarctic exploration, from the first sighting of the continent proper by Fabian von Bellingshausen in 1820 to the expeditions of Amundsen, Scott, Shackleton, and others. With that era of exploration ending, the rest of the map would be filled in with expeditions bearing modern innovations such as radio and aircraft. This is the story of one such expedition, as we turn to their departure 4 months prior to our opening scene. Professor Dyer and his assistant Danforth are discussing their plans and preparing to board their ship. Their scientific expedition to Antarctica is organized by Miskatonic University, located in the fictional town of Arkham, Massachusetts. Both the university and the town are recurring elements of Lovecraft's stories. Dyer remarks that, while Antarctica is virtually barren of life now, in past aeons the continent is believed to have had a temperate or even tropical climate. They hope to explore the Precambrian strata to prove this theory and discover what sort of life once lived there. The expedition will make its way to Antarctica aboard an old whaling vessel, carrying 5 disassembled planes in the hold, which will allow them to move around the continent more easily. They also have a new type of drill that should aid their examination of deeper strata. Just then, they run into other members of the expedition, including Pabody, the engineering professor who created the drill Dyer is so excited to try out, and Professor Lake, a biologist. Danforth and Lake's assistant Gedney are graduate students. Professor Dyer, a geologist, is the expedition commander. The captain comes to tell them they are ready to depart. All present are eager to get underway, as Dyer exhorts them onward, for the honor of Miskatonic University. Thus the 2 ships, the Arkham and Miskatonic, set out from their pleasant New England shores, leaving behind the familiarity of home for dark, savage seas and the mysteries that lay beyond them. The seas are rough, but they power through with their ship's steam engines until at last they arrive at the icy edge of the Antarctic Circle. At one point, Dyer is called up on deck to observe an interesting phenomenon. An odd polar mirage caused the tops of the distant icebergs to appear above the horizon, which is apparently a real phenomenon known to be caused by temperature variation in the atmosphere. Dyer remarks that they look like the ramparts of some great cosmic castle. At last they approach the continent itself, sighting the Admiralty mountain range, a mountain range discovered by British explorer James Ross in 1841. They pass by Ross Island, named after him, where the volcanic Mount Erebus emits a plume of black smoke. Danforth offers a quote from the Edgar Allan Poe story I mentioned at the beginning, suggesting that Ross's report of his discoveries may have inspired the author's descriptions. As this is the southernmost spot accessible by ship, Dyer decides they should make their initial camp here, and they begin to disembark. They assemble shelter and the planes from the hold, the ship captain remarking that the latter will make their services obsolete. The members of the expedition are eager to get started, planning to test their equipment by taking samples from Ross Island before moving further inland. Their radios will allow them to keep in touch with the base camp from anywhere on the continent. The drill works as well as they had hoped, easily cutting through ice and then rock after switching to a different bore. They use dynamite to expose a wider range than just the drill hole. Their early days on the continent are quite easy, I'll be told. The weather is mild for Antarctica, and their tasks have been performed without issue, as Dyer records, but in late November they are preparing to move 700 miles inland via plane, taking all but one of the aircraft and leaving only a few men behind with the ships. They risk worsening weather to do this, but they aren't very worried. The increased efficiency of this arrangement for their research should be worth it. Thus they set off, flying deep into the great white interior of Antarctica. Aboard their aircraft, the men reflect on the difficulties Amundsen must have had passing this way with nothing but skis and sled dogs. The thought encourages them to strive all the harder as they set up their camp and select areas to start taking samples. Their findings intrigue them, discovering fossilized plants and animals that will rewrite the history books. One appears to be evidence of a completely unknown life form. It so intrigues Professor Lake that he plans to lead a survey flight following the rock formation where it was found to the northwest, hoping to find more samples. Dyer is reluctant but takes the second plane with Danforth and Pavity. The inclement weather forces them dangerously close to the mountains. There they see another mirage, similar to what they saw when first approaching the coast, but far stronger. Among the dark mountain ridges, the mirage seems to show regular structures, a labyrinth of walls and strange towers. Dyer and the others are dumbfounded by what they see. After they find their way back out of the mountains, Dyer puts the experience down to a fata morgana, a type of complex illusion caused by atmospheric temperature variation that produces distorted reflections of distant objects. In this case, a mountain range appeared to be a stone city. They try their best to put the encounter out of mind. Later, the expedition members take stock. Their survey flights haven't uncovered much, though they did find a good location for their advanced base. Professor Lake has become increasingly obsessed with the slate they found, hoping to find further evidence of this unknown ancient life form. Dyer thinks he's on the wrong track. The strata they found that rock in was far too old for the sort of complex life Lake thinks it hints at. Dyer wants to move ahead to the new base as planned, but Lake proposes to take a team and some supplies to follow this lead, believing they are on the verge of great things that challenge our understanding of the ancient past. Ultimately, Dyer agrees to let Lake take men and equipment for his search while the new camp is being set up. Thus they set out on dog sleds. Along the way, they encounter a crevasse they must cross, which they do with some ladders lashed together. In the process, however, a rope breaks and one of the sleds fall down. The men and equipment are fine, but two of the dogs are crushed under the sled. Lake says to leave them there. They have work to do. Lake is clearly becoming more and more obsessed. At his direction, they proceed to extract more samples, marking the location of their finds as they go. Back in camp, Lake shows their samples to the rest of the expedition, more stones with the striation pattern. Dyer grants that the pattern is anomalous, but thinks Lake is making too much of a leap to say it indicates a complex organism. He argues they should take the samples back to Miskatonic University for a more thorough analysis, but Lake argues that rival expeditions will come and scoop their discovery. Lake asks for 1 week, 4 planes, and 12 men. Dyer doesn't want to upset their plans to return before the Antarctic winter, nor risk the unknowns involved in Lake's quest. He explains all this calmly to Lake and suggests they will discuss this with clear heads tomorrow, but the biologist is irate. He insists that he will lead a sub-expedition for the next week and storms out to the plains, no longer waiting for permission. Lake insists to his team that scientists around the world would discuss the next weeks of their expedition for generations to come as they prepare to take off. They waste no time resuming taking samples, discovering more of the strange slate. Lake only becomes increasingly obsessed. He angrily rejects orders from the base camp to return in the face of a severe cold front, insisting they continue to move onward. Eventually, they camp on a plateau in the shadow of a great black mountain range that towers over any they had yet seen. As they explore the site, Lake's team stumbles across something incredible, something that Lake calls the find of the century, as they step towards the mountains. Back at the base camp, Dyer and the others receive a message from Lake's group describing the great peaks they have encountered, suggesting they may rival the Himalayas in height. Dyer now wants to link up with Lake to investigate the Black Mountains. and also because it turns out they need the planes he took to finish moving all their gear. The rest of the team thinks Lake is a bit crazy, but are impressed by his results so far. Dyer remains concerned about all the risks his colleague is taking, as Lake now means to undertake an aerial survey of the mountains despite severe weather. As Lake's plane flies among the mountains, so high they need to wear oxygen masks, they note that the rock formations remind them of the ramparts of old castles. They fly low for a closer look, and Lake spies something in the rocks that he immediately demands they investigate. Upon landing, he says it looks like Precambrian slate with upheaved strata, presumably revealed by the wind blowing the snow away. The pilot remarks that he would have doubted the sanity of anyone that suggested they would find a mountainside free of snow in Antarctica, prompting Lake to quip that, "These are the mountains of madness, then." It's a somewhat awkward title drop, but the lack of snow would prove to be the least alarming thing about these mountains. Despite their lack of proper equipment, Lake is determined to get a look and soon comes across an opening in the rock. He believes that the opening looks artificial, as if built rather than a natural deposit. The floor may even have been paved at one point. Lake wishes that Dyer was here to help him make sense of it. He later reports that it doesn't seem to have been carved naturally by water or wind. Lake's assistant Gedney returns later with a full team and proper gear, by which I mean dynamite. This causes a small avalanche, but nobody is hurt, and Gedney dismisses the risks they're taking as necessary. Lake is clearly starting to rub off on him. They uncover a massive chamber and something inside that they immediately report to Lake back at their camp, telling him to come right away. The cave is filled with limestone columns and fossilized remains of cephalopods, coral, and even marine vertebrates, among others. This is all fascinating enough, but Gedney directs Lake to a vast troves of shells and bones that nearly choke off the entire passage, a burial mound from the days when tropical jungles reigned in Antarctica. In observing one of the bones, which appeared to have been cut by a sharp edge, Lake concludes that a large predator must have done it. Other remains show similar trauma, punctured skulls and severed ribs. This confuses them, as it would be inconsistent with the time period these remains appear to date from. Suddenly, the dogs they have with them begin to growl before tearing down the tunnel. Suspecting they had caught the scent of something strange, Lake follows. He comes across an unknown, apparently marine or potentially vegetable life form, or rather the partially fossilized remains of such. Being only partially fossilized, Lake finds its skin leathery yet highly flexible. Gedney interrupts his examination to direct his attention further down the chamber. The cavern is filled with the remains of towering creatures much like the one he just encountered. Bizarre forms with star-shaped heads, unlike anything they have ever seen. Lake is instantly convinced that these creatures are the source of the strange striations in the strata samples they've been taking. Lake's team named the cave of their discovery the Gate to the Past. The biologist's claims grow more dramatic in his next communication with the base camp, claiming that the creatures he's uncovered are reminiscent of the creatures of primal myth spoken of in the Necronomicon. Yes, Miskatonic University has a copy of that most eldritch tome, and it speaks of elder things that created all life on Earth as jest or mistake. Several members of the expedition, including Dyer and Pabody, have read at least parts of the book, and this portion of it has traditionally been thought to be the result of imaginative interpretations of fossils found in antiquity, and an echo of beings of prehistoric folklore worshipped by the Cthulhu cult. Back in the cave, Lake continues to examine the creatures. These aren't fossils. The specimens are still flesh and bone, in a remarkable state of preservation. They are able to move it about and try to make some sense of its bizarre physiology. They find membranous folds like wings, suggesting that the creature was improbably able to fly or glide. Lake finds something he identifies as an eye, also some sort of breathing aperture and an opening that could be a mouth. They also note tentacle-like limbs protruding from the creature's base. When extended, they prove to be about 4 feet long. Lake believes these protrusions were responsible for leaving the strange pattern in the strata they've been following. Effectively, they've been following a set of millions of years old footprints to their owners. Lake is at a loss as to how to classify this creature, having features of aquatic life yet also possessing wing-like limbs too large to be used for underwater propulsion. He plans to bring it back to the camp for a thorough dissection, proclaiming that these discoveries will do for biology what Einstein did for physics. Back at the base camp, Dyer and the others are perplexed by Lake's reports. Frankly, they seem quite unbelievable. Lake also couldn't resist inserting a dig at Dyer for resisting his expedition. Nonetheless, Dyer believes Lake has found something, even if he might be interpreting it incorrectly. In order to clear up the matter, the only thing they can do is go to Lake and speak to him in person. Back at the camp, Lake's men have pulled a dozen specimens of the creatures from the cave. The dogs in camp bark in agitation at the smell of the creatures. Professor Lake wastes no time beginning his dissection, or tries to anyway. The skin of the creature proves impervious to any attempt at precision cutting, and hacking away with a hatchet would be too damaging. Thawing makes no difference. Ultimately, he retrieves a different specimen that appears to have already been mangled, possibly by a rock fall, to probe through its existing wounds. The creature's organs are impossibly intact after all this time. While the tissue itself has some plant-like characteristics, he is able to identify various organ systems, including a digestive system more consistent with animal life. The body also releases an odorous vapor as it thaws, which Lake powers through to continue his work, but it causes a great disturbance among the dogs. They work up into a frenzy such that the men can't calm them down. Upon thawing, Lake finds that the creature's organs are shockingly not desiccated, oozing moisture. He also encounters a viscous green substance that appears to be the creature's blood. Although some aspects of the specimen's biology suggest an extremely early age of Earth's life, it was also extremely complex. This creature had a highly developed nervous system and a 5-lobed brain with evidence of sensory organs. It could also apparently walk, swim, and fly despite its great size. Lake concludes that either the whole conception of the development of life on this planet is incorrect, or the creature did not evolve on this Earth. Having come to this unsettling conclusion, Lake covers his subject with a tarp and orders his men to do the same with the others in the face of the oncoming storm. He tells his men that they've all done a magnificent job, and they should get some rest before the weather turns. Back at the main camp, the other members of the expedition receive Lake's radio report with astonishment and disbelief. Some were even excited, with Pavity congratulating Lake over his finds before he signs off. They will attempt to weather the storm in their tents. Dyer still expresses skepticism, but the others reference the Necronomicon. Many expedition members have curiously flipped through the pages of that bizarre relic, and wonder if Lake has really found the fabled Elder Things. This could be the true treasure uncovered by this expedition, the great secret of Antarctica. Dyer puts a damper on their speculation, reminding them that they will have to wait out the storm too before anything else can be done. The storm hits not long after, with the men on the ship noting the sails are freezing. At the main camp, Dyer orders the men to get the dogs inside and shore up the antenna. Despite this, they can't raise Lake on the radio through this storm. All they can do is wait and hope for the best. Far into the storm, in the shadow of those black, howling peaks, Lake's assistant Gedney stumbles through the wind in a state of clear distress. Somebody calls his name, but impossibly Gedney believes it sounds like Professor Dyer. He warns the professor to stay away, it isn't safe. Then he stops and stares in horror at something in the dark as the wind whips through the wreckage of Lake's camp. After the storm has passed, the main camp has weathered it without much damage, but they are still unable to contact Lake even with the cleared weather. If all the radios on all 4 of Lake's planes are out, the situation must be serious. In short order, Dyer announces that this is now a rescue mission. They ready their remaining plane and even the sled dogs. Some try to talk Dyer out of taking hasty action. Without any basis or any knowledge of the situation, he will be taking a risk that endangers everyone on the rescue team, but Dyer refuses to waste a moment with lives on the line. They set out across the white waste, grim-faced and determined. Lake is still unresponsive to their radio calls, which only boosts Dyer's sense of urgency, pushing through a dangerous storm to reach Lake's camp faster. This almost causes an emergency when the cargo comes loose, but they find themselves among the Black Mountains. They quickly realize, as Lake must have, that these mountains are part of the stratum pushed up rather than being volcanic. Dyer sees another distorted mirage in the skies above the mountain range, seeming to show an incomprehensible cyclopean city hanging in the air. The men are stunned by the scale and sinister character of their remote and desolate surroundings. Dyer cannot help but be disturbed by how these sites resemble ancient myth. This place calls to mind the evil plateau of Leng found in primal writings. One ancient manuscript speaks of the god Sathagua, whose devotees are supposedly as alien as the god itself. Men of science like themselves would not take such things seriously, of course, but they could not help but think of them when surrounded by such strange and archaic peaks. For Dyer's part, he regrets ever opening the pages of the Necronomicon and allowing such ideas to enter his mind. Eventually, they spot what appears to be shapes partially buried in the snow. Nearby, a patch of snow appears to have been dug out. They have found Lake's camp. Even as they land nearby, they can tell the camp is in bad shape. What's more, they can see drag marks in the snow leading to a cave in the mountainside. Thankfully, a break in the weather allows them to land. Dyer reminds everyone that their priority is helping Lake and his team. Only after they're confirmed safe will they investigate whatever Lake found. Thus, the Miskatonic expedition stumbles across the scene we began this story with. The camp buried in snow, tents torn asunder, and the plains little more than wrecks. They soon find all that remains of Lake's team, their bodies smashed and torn. Dyer locates the body of the unfortunate Professor Lake, whose remains have been horrifically and meticulously mutilated. His face had been carved off from the rest of his head. The expedition can only stare in horror before Dyer shakes himself out of it and calls on the rest to resume their search for survivors. As they examine the bodies, it becomes clear that none of these men were killed by flying debris from the storm or any incidental cause. Any doubts about that were put to rest when they entered the only tent still standing. It was Lake's dissection tent, but the strange creature wasn't what they found there. Bodies filled the space, man and dog in a state of dismemberment. Some were stripped to the bone with their entire skeletons removed. Meat and organs had been cut out and separated. It was more like a butcher shop than a dissection room in a laboratory. Bizarrely, salt taken from the camp's provisions appeared to have been sprinkled around the bodies. There are other oddities. The gasoline stove that had been set up in the tent appears to be missing entirely. Pages from what seems to be Lake's biology books have been marked with a strange swirling pattern. Dyer tries and fails to make sense of any of this. This horror is beyond his imagination. Before he can spend any more time contemplating it, Dyer is called out to see something the others have found outside. It has the dogs riled up, a mound of snow in the shape of a 5-pointed star, and something is buried under it. They've also identified 11 of the bodies. The 12th and final member of Lake's crew, Gedney, is unaccounted for. One of the dog sleds is also missing, so they surmise he may have escaped. Pabody leads a team in the plane in search of Gedney, while Dyer and the rest do what little they can for the remains of Lake's team. They bury them in the snow and erect a cross from 2 metal beams as a grave marker. They then set about preparing their own tents before investigating the star-shaped mound. The men have yet to find any of the specimens that Lake described in his report, which puzzles them. The fierce winds and wind-borne debris fail to explain it, nor most of the damage to the camp. Dyer notices that most of the damage is oddly targeted, more the signs of an investigation than random destruction, as if the machines had been torn to pieces to reveal their mechanism. More conspicuously, there was a pile of cans from the camp provisions. The sides had been pried away to reveal their contents, and then seemingly discarded in a heap. Some provisions had simply gone missing. Dyer also looks at the strange drag marks leading to a cave. This, they surmise, is the gateway to the past Lake spoke of in his reports, where he found his specimens, his elder things. They haven't had the chance to investigate it, but Dyer instead takes the extremely cautious step of barricading the entrance, saying they lack the men and equipment to investigate it. Perhaps he fears that whatever happened to Lake is tied to this cave. They use the wrecked equipment to form a barricade, though it is no barrier against their growing unease. Back at the star-shaped mound, the men have taken measurements and found the dimensions of it to be remarkably exact. As they start to dig, there's a pungent odor that only gets stronger. Someone buried something here, which they ultimately find to be the missing specimens. They had been interred in an upright position. Dyer can't think of any reason Lake and his men may have done this, surmising that they must have been mad. However, only 5 of the specimens are here. One of them shows signs of Lake's dissection, while the others all show some other sign of damage. Lake had told them 8 of his dozen specimens were in pristine condition, so where were they? Their speculation is interrupted by Pabody's return. Sadly, they found no trace of Gedney, and even if he avoided all that befell the camp, he would likely have succumbed to the elements by now. Pabody suggests they return to base camp and then back to the ships. This expedition has gone on long enough. Dyer has other ideas, however. He points out that there is one place they haven't looked for Gedney, the other side of the mountains. It would be dangerous. Even the lowest pass of the mountains that they can see would challenge the service ceiling of their aircraft, but Dyer is determined. He will not leave this god-forsaken continent without some answers to this horror. If the winds subside tomorrow, he will fly to the Black Mountains. The winds died down just as Dyer hoped. He plans to go up with as little equipment as possible to save weight and make it easier to get over the mountains. Only his assistant Danforth will be accompanying him. Pabody is against the trip, as the conditions make it extremely dangerous. but Dyer reiterates that Gedney is their only hope of getting an explanation for what happened in the camp. With how many have died already, he can't leave without understanding why. They plan to return in 15 hours and check in by radio every hour. Thus, Dyer and Danforth take off and set forth into the Black Mountain Range. Examining the mountainsides as they ascend, Dyer concludes that the ambiguous formations they had glimpsed before are indeed artificial structures. They were worn down by the wind, but still recognizable as an intentional construction. Despite all the bizarre happenings, the two do their best to analyze the situation calmly, as researchers should. Using their camera and binoculars, Dyer, who is a geologist if you recall, identifies the material of the structures as a quartzite, unlike any geologic layer observed to this point. Danforth concurs when they switch off piloting, pointing out a similar 5-pointed formation to the mound they found at the camp. Everything they see really just raises more questions. These peaks are unquestionably extremely ancient, but the structures defy any explanation compatible with their understanding of the history of life on Earth. They also note that some of the mountains appear to be honeycombed with tunnels. At last they approach the mountain pass they intend to use, having almost reached the required altitude. A foreboding sense comes over Dyer as the piping wind drowns out even the engine of the plane, a sense that they are passing the threshold of the world known by man into entirely alien territory. Their territory. Finally, they beheld the secrets of an ancient and unknown world. A vast megalopolis sprawled out beneath them, walkways and boulevards connecting massive structures, ziggurats and spires jutting out of the labyrinthine city. Dyer and Danforth are dumbstruck, even as they recognize the familiar motif of the 5-pointed star repeated in the city's architecture. They have found the ruins of a civilization that thrived long before modern man had a recognizable form. The professor finds himself questioning all the old stories he had dismissed as myths of the Elder Things and other eldritch tales, of the demonic plateau of Leng, of the Migo, or abominable snowmen of the Himalayas, of the Narcotic manuscripts and their pre-human implications, of the Cthulhu cult, of the Necronomicon, and the Hyperborean legends of formless Sathagua. He can scarcely believe what he's seeing, drawing comparisons to the legendary locations of Atlantis and Lemuria, but especially Olatho, a lost city of Lovecraft's own mythology. Dyer and Danforth are transfixed by the jumble of titanic towers below them. Dyer decides that aerial observations will not suffice, and so they must find a place to land, despite Danforth's misgivings. They will be out of radio range for the camp. They soon find a suitable spot on the snowfield and settle down. From their new vantage point, it's clear that some of these structures extend into the crevices deep below the ground. Dyer gives them 5 hours to investigate before they must be back at the plane. They equip themselves with lights, ropes, provisions, and other items before staking the plane's landing skis to prevent sliding. After affirming that the mirage they saw earlier in the expedition was probably this place, they venture towards one of the massive structures, its layout in the shape of a 5-pointed star. From their composition, Dyer surmises that the walls of the structure must have endured for millions of years, though any inner partitions must have been made of less sturdy material since they were gone now. They're looking for an entrance that will take them deeper inside the structures, which will hopefully be more preserved. Eventually, they stumble across a field of strange spires, which Dyer quickly realizes are actually petrified wood. These are ancient trees from what looks to have been a park or an orchard. Just then, a strange piping noise resounds through the area. In searching for its source, the men spy a cave mouth similar to the one Lake found his specimens in, another gateway to the past. As the mysterious noise fades, Dyer unconvincingly assures Danforth that this civilization died out long ago. There can be nothing lurking down there. They continue among the ruins, spotting more repetitions of the star motif. At one point, they pass under a canopy of jagged ice. It crumbles as they go, sending sharp icicles stabbing down into the snow around them. Danforth tumbles, but both are physically unharmed. Unfortunately, this turns out to be a bit of a breaking point for Danforth. He insists that something is responsible for that piping sound, and it wants to impede their investigation. Dyer is concerned for his assistant's state of mind, and suggests they return to the plane to rest, but Danforth insists on pushing forward. Deeper in, they recognize carved sections in the stone and the remains of ancient plant life. They even stumble across something that looks like a lock on a door, though composed entirely of rust at this point. Eventually, they come across a gap looking downward, where they can see the lower levels are much better preserved. The walls and floors are elaborately carved and decorated. Improbably, they still hope Gedney might have found his way through the mountains and taken refuge here. Hurrying on for fear of getting caught in another blizzard, the men stumble across a great tower, a babble for a tongue no human ever knew. Danforth and Dyer approach the tower, marveling at its ancient construction and the alien minds that lived in it. For 100 million years it must have stood without ever knowing the footsteps of men until now. Once inside, Danforth quickly realizes that they could get lost in the labyrinth of halls, but Dyer devises a plan to use the paper they brought with them to mark their path. Thankfully, there doesn't appear to be any airflow in the building, so their trail won't be disrupted. Thus prepared, they decide to first visit the top of the structure before exploring its interior. While there clearly used to be further floors, the current top of the tower still provides a commanding view of the spread of the city, all the way back to the Black Mountains. On the way up, Dyer took note that the beings who lived here did not seem to use staircases, rather traveling between floors via inclined planes or ribbed stone ramps. Dyer is still having trouble making sense of how this jumble of structures is balanced. He leads Danforth to explore the interior. The dark halls are much better preserved than any of the structures they've seen. The five-pointed star is omnipresent, but the elaborate detail preserved in the other carvings are remarkable. Strange and bizarre creatures are clearly visible in the reliefs of one lower chamber. Dyer first suggests these are the myths and legends of those that lived here, but he reconsiders upon spying what appears to be recognizable dinosaurs amongst other creatures. They also appear to show the foreboding star-shaped heads of the creatures Lake discovered. This is a record of their history. Danforth and Dyer had been holding onto the hope that some impossible race of humans had made all this, that the star shape was only a totem those men worshipped, but this puts an end to that. What Lake described in his report he compared to descriptions of the elder things described in the obscure tomes of the Miskatonic University Library. To Dyer, who has also read those texts, the relief uncannily tells the same history described there. None of the carvings they encounter tell a complete story, and they don't appear in a chronological order, but through his past readings and conversations with the university folklorist, Dyer is able to piece together the following account. They arrived on the nascent, lifeless earth, riding cosmic winds to plunge deep into the primordial sea. They began their habitation on this planet living below the waves. Dyer isn't willing to speculate on where they came from, be it another world, another galaxy, or another universe altogether. Regardless of their origin, they set about making this world their own. Using advanced machines and technology operating on unknown principles of energy, they carved and constructed their unfathomable city below. Their knowledge and technology vastly surpassed even that of modern man. Thus they used their understanding of biology to create the first life on Earth, initially for food, and later for other purposes. Their masterpiece was an amorphous protoplasmic bulk, which, under the mental command of its masters, could form temporary organs and structures for specific tasks. These shapeless slaves were named in the Necronomicon as Shoggoths, though the book hadn't hinted such creatures existed on Earth. While the Elder Things civilization started underwater, they soon adapted to the land, using their lower tentacles to move along the ground and propel themselves into the air, gliding on their wings. With the help of their Shoggoth servants, they constructed new cities on the surface. They developed a sophisticated intellectual and artistic culture, writing text and carving images using their feelers. Each point of their 5-pointed heads had a sensory organ. As for their diet, they had the plant-like ability to draw sustenance from inorganic sources, but they much preferred meat, mostly in the form of uncooked marine life under the sea, but they butchered and cooked their food on land. In much later images, a simian primate figure, not unlike man, is seized for sustenance. Those images in particular bear a horrifying resemblance to what happened in Lake's dissection tent. There are also indications that the Elder Things engaged in commerce, trading between their great cities using flat 5-pointed counters as currency. They found several of these in Lake's camp as well. Thus, the civilization of the Elder Things went on for millions of years, enduring dramatic shifts in the Earth's climate and tectonics. Even they had their limits, however. The glaciations of the Pleistocene era were too much for them. They tried to keep their land cities warm with machines, but ultimately had to retreat to their original undersea dwellings. The old tomes in the university speak of a sort of hibernation or stasis that the creatures used to survive the long journey through the void of space, but by this time they had been on Earth too long, and that method was lost. They could not use it to survive this indefinite cold. Though they could not live on the surface, they still traveled there and explored there as Triphibian beings, capable of ranging by land, sea, and air. They possessed both acute intellect and physical endurance. Indeed, very few of the creatures ever seemed to die except by violence. When they did die, their custom was to bury the dead vertically under great star-shaped mounds. Maps carved into the walls show the process of continental drift, with what was once a greater landmass around Antarctica breaking up and moving northward to gradually become the continents we know today. The Elder Things and their civilization endured for so long that they witnessed this happening. With the upheaval of entirely new land in the Pacific Ocean, however, tremendous things began to happen as another race arrived on Earth. This race being even more alien than the Elder Things and prepared to challenge their domination of this world. Having a form similar to octopus, these were the pre-human spawn of the Great Old One known as Cthulhu. What followed was a monstrous war of titanic proportions between the Cthulhu spawn and the Elder Things. For all their knowledge and advanced technology, the Elder Things were driven back. The Cthulhu spawn were composed of matter strange and bizarre even to the Elder Things, capable of many transformations and reintegrations that made them very difficult to destroy. Eventually, peace was made between them. The new land, recently risen from the sea, was given to the Cthulhu spawn, while the Elder Things kept to their older lands. The Cthulhu spawn erected their own city, Frightful Brilgay, in dedication to the Great Old One. There they developed apart from the Elder Things, until suddenly the very land they had fought over cataclysmically collapsed back into the sea, dragging the Cthulhu spawn with it into the darkest depths. Once again, the Elder Things were supreme in their world, and they expanded. The great reptiles that had come to populate the world at that time proved tractable, and they tamed them for their own purposes, but the Shoggoth remained their most useful servants. In time, however, the unthinking protoplasmic mass of the Shoggoth developed awareness. The hypnotic suggestions of their masters to reform their bodies time and time again eventually stabilized as a sort of consciousness. They could still receive the commands of and appreciate the will of their creators, but they did not have to obey. Then, some 150 million years ago, the Shoggoth rebelled against their masters. In the face of this threat, the Elder Things developed new weapons that could disrupt the molecules of the Shoggoths, ultimately achieving complete victory. Their final great enemy would come once more from the stars. They arrived in the Jurassic period, resembling half fungus and half crustaceans. These bizarre beings are half remembered in myth as the Migo, or somehow inspiring the abominable snowmen of the Himalayas. Their civilization being battered by both past invasions and the rebellion, the Elder Things were driven from their northern lands. Over time, thanks to the Migo and cataclysmic events in the Earth's geologic history, the cities of the Elder Things were destroyed and their territory shriveled away until they gradually converged on Antarctica. There they built this place, their final city. Then the great cold of the Miocene era came, and the cold never left. Dyer suspects the Elder Things must have abandoned the city in the face of the cold, but Danforth believes there must have been something else that drove them. Dyer says that what's carved into the wall may answer that question. We are then showed what appears to be an Elder Thing beheaded by the appendage of a Shoggoth. The last carving they find appears to be a map of the city, which they duly record to help find their way. Dyer believes all of this requires a much more in-depth follow-up investigation, but he isn't ready to leave yet. With this map, Dyer believes he has identified the path down to a great subterranean abyss where the Elder Things built their final refuge. He wants to at least reconnoiter that far for a follow-up survey, despite the failing power of their flashlights. Even if it sidetracks them from the search for Gedney, Dyer must see it for himself. They encounter another mural, this one damaged, but disconcertingly it seems to have been deliberately smashed recently. That doesn't make any sense. Everything here has been dead for millions of years, right? Dyer can't bring himself to accept the alternative possibility. They push onward for the exit tunnel, but soon catch a whiff of a familiar smell. At first they think it is the same smell that came from the star-shaped mound at Lake's camp, the smell of the Elder Things after they die. It's unthinkable that an organic scent would survive all this time, unless somehow a few of the Elder Things survived. But as they approach, they realize the smell is actually something much more mundane: gasoline. Incredibly, it must be coming from the supplies taken from the camp. They conclude it must be Gedney, having miraculously fled to this city through the mountains and taken refuge. They soon stumble across sled tracks, deep and indicating a heavy load of supplies. They follow the tracks until they abruptly stop, finding batteries and a seemingly random assortment of supplies from the camp. Dyer and Danforth are confused by why Gedney might have brought these things, but they also find a detailed map drawn on paper from their camp, much like the one they made earlier. Dyer concludes that Gedney indeed came this way, and the map seems to indicate that the tunnel leads to the center of the city. They use a nearby exit to confirm their position, discovering the tower drawn on the map, which had been invisible from the air due to the collapsed structures around it. They're reassured to find that they're still close to the plane, and soon find the sleds from Lake's camp partially buried in snow. The items upon them are bizarre. The stove missing from Lake's tent is there, along with other seemingly random items. Even Dyer, whose attitude about Gedney's survival to this point could be described as denial, realizes that Gedney could not possibly have hauled 2 sleds all this way, nor could he have laden them with such a collection. Grasping at straws, Dyer weakly suggests that someone must have been with Gedney, but he was the only one unaccounted for at Lake's camp. They move into a nearby passage to investigate where whoever pulled those sleds may have gone. Inside, there are 2 covered bundles, one vaguely shaped as if covering a person. Dyer and Danforth approach in silence, dreading what they are about to discover. Pulling back the tarp reveals a pair of bandaged feet. When they uncover the head, they see that it is Gedney. He is dead, and has been for some time. His body appears to have been cleaned and bandages placed on the cuts made into his flesh. He looks like a body placed in a morgue after an autopsy, frozen with careful incisions sewn back together. At this point, the 2 men are forced to admit the only remaining possibility. The Elder Things did this to Gedney, and brought him here from the camp. The other bundle turns out to be a dog in much the same condition as Gedney. Their revelation is interrupted by a screeching noise. Something else is undeniably alive down here. It's coming from the passage to the abyss, the last refuge of the Elder Things. After a moment of dreadful anticipation, Dyer actually recognizes the sound. It's a sound they've been hearing ever since arriving on the continent. Penguins. They're hearing the call of penguins. Dyer suggests a flock of them must have found their way to the city and nested in the tunnels. He wants to follow the noise, so they cover poor Gedney to be recovered on their return journey. As they go, they notice more drag marks on the floor. Something came through here recently. The marks follow the path to the abyss. Dyer spells out what neither man has been willing to admit to themselves until now. They're following the path of the 8 missing specimens from Lake's camp. The Elder Things, somehow revived after millions of years of dormancy, laid waste to Lake's camp and took what supplies they might use before coming here in search of their people's last sanctuary. Then Dyer and Danforth stumble across the source of the screeching, and it is penguins, just as Dyer said. An abnormally large new species of pale penguins does indeed nest in these tunnels. Each of them is over 6 feet tall, larger than the largest known emperor penguin. Their ancestors must have moved down into the tunnels to avoid the cold, and they appear to have adapted to subterranean life by losing their pigmentation and eyesight. They pay no mind to the 2 men, who realize the penguins are nesting in the antechamber to the abyss. This proves that this area remained habitable for large life forms. However, if warmth and food lie below, what drove these creatures this far up? To answer that question, Dyer and Danforth move forward. The passage has more finely preserved carvings, and the floor is worn down from significant traffic. The temperature is also getting warmer. In time, the fine carvings give way to rough igneous rock. The volcanic heat explains how anything might survive down here. The passage itself, however, shows signs of damage. Then they are suddenly hit by a foul, familiar smell, the same musk of the dead Elder Things from Lake's camp. What carvings exist at this level are much cruder than those before, as if poorly imitated or made in mockery. They might suggest a declining era of the Elder Things culture, or something else. What's more, the passage that should be there according to their map isn't, but they do find some items from Lake's camp. Danforth decides it's time to go back. They discovered quite enough, and it's time to retreat to their plane and the camp. Dyer refuses, insisting that if there is something down here, some answer, he must find it. I'm not sure even he knows what he's looking for at this point. This causes Danforth to lose his composure and accuse Dyer of having lost his mind. After all, they know those things must have pulled Gedney's corpse with them and must lurk down here somewhere. Well, they turn out to be much closer than they think. Dyer stumbles across them presently. Covered in that viscous green substance approximating blood, the towering bodies sit in the tunnels. The men stare in shock and horror at the alien carnage. Green continues to pool around them, suggesting that whatever happened here was very recent. Dyer quickly puts this together, and also notes that there are only 4 of them, rather than the 8 that were missing from Lake's camp. He's shaken by finding yet another scene of slaughter so soon after the camp, but he quickly begins speculating about what may have done this. The penguins couldn't have done this sort of damage, so all Dyer can think is that they fought among themselves. If they found the 2 men here, they wouldn't stand a chance. Dyer speculates further. This must have been the battle that drove the penguins into the outer caves. Perhaps it was a running battle, with one group making a run for the sleds before being caught and killed. But then another, more frightful possibility occurred to Dyer as he looks up at one of the bodies. He remembers that last carving of a beheaded elder thing, and a Shoggoth. Danforth notices the critical detail at the same time. It took them some time to notice due to the alien nature of the bodies, but each and every one of them was headless. These things were not merely killed, they were ritualistically slaughtered. That's when Danforth and Dyer noticed something else. A glistening black slime clinging to the corpses, and a horrible new smell. A pale, foul-smelling mist filters into the tunnel, forcing the men to cover their faces. It smells even worse than the corpses. Then a strange sound calls out. Tekelili! Tekelili! Dyer realizes that, whatever that mist is, it's approaching them with intention, as if it were something alive. An overwhelming panic grips the men, and, before they even know it, they start to turn to flee. But not before they see more. A black shine, like glistening oil, moves towards them, pushing aside rock and stone blocks. A horrible, amorphous mass emerges into the space, within which the severed heads of the elder things are still visible. Dyer and Danforth run, sprinting back up the tunnel, back to the penguins' nesting chamber. The pale birds screech as they pass, and the men stop to catch their breath on the other side. They look back, but wish they hadn't. The twisting, shimmering mass bursts into the chamber, its great gelatinous form filled with eyes. A greenish light fills the room, and several of the penguins are quickly crushed by falling rubble and the rushing monster. Dyer names it Shoggoth, the most abominable creature born under any star, one of the amorphous organic slaves engineered to serve the will of the elder things before they rebelled. It would seem that they rebelled again after the elder things retreated to their last refuge here in Antarctica, this time successfully killing their masters. Dyer and Danforth find themselves meeting the horribly intelligent gaze of the monster's many, many imitated eyes. In the Necronomicon, the mad author wrote that the Shoggoth had no voices save for the imitated accents of their former masters. That cry they heard earlier, however, Tekelili, was familiar to the 2 men. It was written by Edgar Allan Poe less than a century prior in his own story of bizarre encounters in the far south, where the mysterious cry was associated with strange off-white birds and repeated in fearful tones by inhabitants encountered there. Lest this be confusing, Lovecraft often has artistic types of people be strangely in tune with the bizarre aspects of his mythos, often perceiving aspects of it through dreams and occasionally visions. He also enjoys intermingling real historical places and persons with his created ones to give them a sense of verisimilitude. That's essentially what he's doing here, placing Poe, one of his favorite influences, in the context of his universe as someone that perceived this ghoulish echo of the elder things that was otherwise heard only by the pale penguins for untold eons. But let us return to Dyer and Danforth, who have shaken themselves from their revelation and started running for their lives. Unfortunately, the Shoggoth is gaining on them. Dyer realizes they won't make it if they make a straight run for the exit, so they must try to lose it in the labyrinth of the tunnels first, diverting them into a narrow side passage. Thankfully, they still have the map from earlier, and Dyer is able to quickly work out an alternative route as the tunnels are all interconnected. The flaw in this plan is that the Shoggoth is able to simply burst through the wall in pursuit of them. Nonetheless, the men push on and stumble across a hall of statues of the Elder Things, which Dyer deduces is a mausoleum of heroic figures of their past. This triggers an epiphany in the professor. The Elder Things were not evil monsters. Alien in form and advanced in knowledge though they were, they behaved as men, rather as rational beings, awakening after millions of years in slumber into brutally cold temperatures surrounded by frenzied barking quadrupeds and pale simians cutting apart their fellows. Of course they lashed out at the perceived threat, pillaging the camp and bodies for anything they could use before setting off for what they hoped would be a sanctuary. Instead, they found only death and the imitative cries of the Shoggoth. Maybe the four unaccounted for found their way to the abyss, though who knows if the Elder Thing's ancient refuge still survives, or if the Shoggoth or the cold destroyed it after all this time. But the men have more immediate concerns than these, as they see a new glow down the tunnel ahead, not the eerie green of the Shoggoth, but the pale light of day from the surface snowscape. It isn't the same place they entered the tunnels. It's nearly a miracle they found it. Dyer wonders if something guided them this way, to escape the tunnels from those ancient secret depths. They emerge onto the side of a tower, once again in the open air. The side of the tower is carved with more reliefs, which Dyer speculates is some sort of farewell message from the Elder Things. The men ascend the tower to get their bearing, overlooking the Cyclopean city once again. In one of the few strokes of luck they've experienced in these past hours, Dyer recognizes the nearby ruins and realizes they're not far from the plain. As they approach, Dyer stops Danforth and asks him to make a promise not to reveal what they found in these mountains once they returned, that the city and its dwellers should keep their secrets for all eternity. Danforth agrees, and the pair set their minds to the task of getting through the storm and back over the peaks in one piece. The engines start and they take to the air, leaving the city of the Elder Things far below. Seeing Danforth shaking hands, Dyer takes the controls. As he approaches the pass, the younger man looks back in the direction of the city. They pass among the dark peaks, and then Danforth sees something. He sees something and screams. Dyer is bewildered, and being less experienced with the controls, demands Danforth's help managing them as he nearly collides with a ridge. However, Danforth is inconsolable, muttering about the mirage. Eventually, they come to the end of the mountain range. Back at the remains of Professor Lake's camp, the rest of the team notes that they haven't had radio contact with Dyer and Danforth in quite some time. They've gotten 2 of the 3 planes working, so they plan to return to the base camp tomorrow if they don't hear from them. Just then, they notice the plane and flag them down with flares. They rush to ask what happened to them, and if they found out what happened to Gedney. Dyer is silent. Danforth collapses, groaning and rambling, into the snow. They're confused and horrified, but Dyer simply tells them to leave Danforth be, and that they should all just try to get home. The next morning, January 7th, 1931, the expedition abandoned all their luggage at Lake's camp to be covered by the snow, returning by airplane to their previous base camp. By the 28th, they had made their way back to their ship at McMurdo Sound. 5 days later, they set sail for the long journey back to Miskatonic University and Arkham, leaving all they saw in the deep cold behind, in body if not in mind. Standing on the deck of the ship, Dyer feels as numb in body as the stinging cold around him, impervious to the captain's good-natured attempts to cheer him over the deaths of his fellows on the expedition. To him, even these more familiar outer reaches of Antarctica now seemed to him a foreboding barrier set in warning of the horrors lying beyond. Antarctica, where life and death, space and time have made black and blasphemous alliances in the unknown epoch since matter first writhed and swam on the matter's scarce-cooled crust. He thanks heaven they are clear of her. We move ahead in time, years after the expedition in the town of Arkham, Massachusetts. In his study, Professor Dyer is disturbed to read that another expedition party plans to take the same route they did despite knowing about the deaths of Professor Lake's party. He tried to warn them as best he could without revealing the full truth, that for the peace and safety of mankind, Earth's unplumbed depths must be let alone, lest sleeping abnormalities awaken to resurgent life, and nightmares surge out of the deep of time. Walking the streets of Arkham, Dyer contemplates the fragile shelter that is civilization as he goes to visit Danforth. The poor assistant never recovered from whatever he saw in those last moments before the plane crossed the mountains. Now in a sanitarium, he's stopped trying to harm himself, but his lucidity depends on the day. Sometimes he crawls around his room or rambles nonsensically, speaking of black pits, Proto-Shoggoth, Yog-Sothoth, a color out of space, eyes in the darkness, and repeating that strange cry, Tekeli-li. On other days, he seems almost entirely his old self and repudiates those ramblings, attributing them to his school days perusing of the university's copy of the Necronomicon. He refuses to elaborate on that final horror only he witnessed. As he gazes up at the stars, that ineffable spread of the cosmos, Dyer shudders to imagine what, in a mere glimpse, could have caused Danforth to break down so utterly, even after all they had already seen. Reflecting on the humanity around him and the vast ancient universe above, Dyer thinks that he would not disturb those who believe mankind to be the most splendid creature to ever stride the earth by revealing what he knows. It would not have been so horrifying if only the ruins had remained of the elder things, silent and dead. Instead, their cries echo as a distorted mockery from those monstrous things that were once their servants. And who's to say that some of the elder things don't still survive in some deep, watery crevasse, hidden away from the world yet explored by man? From there, or perhaps from the depths of the cosmos from whence they came, that cry may be heard again. Tekeli-li! Tekeli-li! Thus we close our tale of impossibly ancient horror at the extremes of Earth's climate. Like I said, this is one of, if not my absolute favorite, of Lovecraft's stories. He uses the Antarctic setting to great effect to get across a sense of scale and desolation, both in the environment and in the revelations about the Elder Things. Go Tanabe captures all of that brilliantly in his art. The story also somewhat recontextualizes Lovecraft's entire Cthulhu mythos, where many of those stories, including those I've covered before, tend to lean heavily into the occult. This one blurs the line with science fiction while maintaining the same themes. It gives us this genuinely alien race that apparently created most life on Earth purely as livestock. To them, mankind is nothing more than that. And despite their apparent power and alien forms, the Elder Things are, in certain ways, very much like us, in the way they build their civilization, behaving as rational beings concerned with their own survival. Yet they too are unable to contend with cosmic forces beyond their comprehension, and subject to destruction. Gruesome parallels between the conduct of the expedition as scientists and the behavior of the Elder Things towards them helps hammer this point home. It all comes back to Lovecraft's view that our civilization is really just a temporary island of stability and safety in the face of the grand scale of the universe. Danforth's fate in the end, and the mystery of his final glance back, serves as a final reminder that, as disturbing as the discoveries about the Elder Things are, there are things in this vast universe far more frightening and incomprehensible than them, or even the Shoggoth. In the original story, left out of the adaptation, Dyer notes that Danforth was looking in the direction of another, even larger mountain range in the distance, one that the carvings of the Elder Things regarded with fear, a forbidden place. The implication being that Danforth glimpsed something that was at least as monstrous to the Elder Things as they seem to us. That's the trick. Again, the Elder Things aren't really the sinister villains in this story. The ones in Lake's camp were just acting the same as many humans would be if we woke up starving and found a bunch of bipedal stakes poking around in the corpse of a companion. They eliminated the immediate threat, prepared provisions, buried their dead friends, and set out to look for sanctuary, only to get ambushed by the Shoggoth once they found their way to the city. My only criticism of the story itself is that, aside from some foreboding statements about the things they found in Antarctica, the first third to almost half of the story is a fairly uneventful recounting of the progress of the expedition up until the discovery of Lake's camp. There's little intrigue and some building tension, but it can be a bit boring. Go Tanabe made a very smart choice in the adaptation by starting with the horror of Lake's camp, which then makes the early parts much more tense. To loosely paraphrase an example Alfred Hitchcock used to explain building tension, audiences aren't tense because there's a sudden explosion in a scene. Surprised, yes, but not tense. Tension is created when you show the bomb first, and thus the audience knows there will be an explosion, but not when, or why, or exactly how. Related to that, Tanabe also made Lake a bit more manic, and made his friction with Dyer more dramatic just to make those earlier sequences more interesting. A random note, just because I found it interesting: the theory of continental drift wasn't fully accepted until after Lovecraft's death in the 1950s and 60s, but he still wrote it into his story. He may have been a notorious shut-in that was suspicious of just about everything, but he did keep himself up to date on modern science and technology, even if he didn't always understand it very well. Lastly, I got my hands on the hardcover deluxe edition of this, and it actually had a pretty interesting interview in the back of it between Go Tanabe and the translator, Zach Davison. Davison actually says most manga creators whose work he's translated are pretty reclusive, In fact, the contracts usually forbid him from contacting the creator. This one did not, and in fact almost as soon as he signed the contract, Go Tanabe was in his DMs, and they've had a friendly exchange since. They talk about Tanabe's process, how he creates his panels, and how he came to adapt Lovecraft's work. Apparently he had plenty of ideas for creepy monster drawings, but he struggled to construct story ideas, so his editor suggested adapting Lovecraft. Davison talks a bit about the history of Lovecraft in Japan. It's a bit like it is in the West. A lot of people are vaguely aware of his work through references in games and media, but not that many people have actually read the stories, though they've been available in Japanese translation since the 1950s. The first manga adaptation of Lovecraft was actually published all the way back in 1962, an adaptation of The Dunwich Horror by Shigeru Mizuki, modified to a Japanese setting. All that isn't directly related to this work, but I thought it was cool and wanted to mention it. That's all for now. If you liked this, I have some shorter coverage of Lovecraft manga that I made a while back you can check out, and go ahead and let me know what you think. Like, leave a comment, and all that if you want to see further coverage of Lovecraft. In any case, I hope you have a good day.